Okay, so the screen is all right at your end?
Yes, absolutely fine.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the next class with me, which is on winemaking. And in particular, we are going to have a look at not only to understand the winemaking process, but also to appreciate how it impacts on the style of wine in our glass. So we can really think through and apply it to the practical setting of the hospitality industry. As I understand, you have gone through the various questions around grape growing and viticulture in general with Keith during the last session. So let us just start with one interesting aspect of for winemaking, because of course the work in the vineyard throughout the year goes in to then be able to have good quality ingredient for winemaking. Now, at the time of the harvest, and when the time of the harvest is, what we are looking at is to make sure that we've got an ideal maturity of the grapes. So I have brought in a Barry into our virtual classroom, and to be able to talk through the key components of the grape. As you will see, I have listed three elements: sugar, acidity, and phenols. Because when we are making a decision about when to pick the grapes in the vineyard, what we are looking for is a balance between these three components. First of all, sugar will be key. Sugar will be key for us to produce alcohol, as we have learned that during the first session about the fermentation process. So clearly, in the vineyard, you have done a lot of work, canopy management, and lots of other different work that will help you to ripen grapes, increase the sugar content, which is key to fermentation. At the same time, as we know, when fruit is ripening, then there are two reverse processes. One is that the sugar is increasing and the acidity is decreasing. So what we would want to achieve is that ideal balance between having the right level of sugar, whilst we also still have freshness through acidity. And then the last element to consider is that we need to have also ideal maturity for phenols. So phenols or tannins are practically, if you think about your morning chai or green tea, is the best way to relate to it in this virtual environment. Because if you make a cup of tea, then if you brew it for a very brief time, then it will be lighter and it will be also easier on the palate. But if you're going to have a cup of tea that has been brewed with the tea leaves in there for a couple of minutes or so, especially if we talk about green tea, then when you drink that tea, it will be quite astringent, quite drying on the palate, quite gripping, and that is because you have increased the amount of tannins in there. Now, it's not only the amount of tannins, but the nature of the tannins, because when you've got an underripe grape, then those tannins will feel what we call a greener, harsher in character. Whereas when it is riper, then it will be plusher, more velvety, smoother, mellower feel. So what you want to achieve is that when you look at the berries, and we talked about that it's a refractometer that can help you to measure the sugar content, you will also want to taste the berries, because the balance is always much more appreciated, not only by numbers, but the human tasting experience. And that will also give you the opportunity to feel the tannic or phenolic ripeness. Now, the sugar and the acidity will be in the juice. So the flesh of the berry is really key for us. But as you can see, we have peeled off this virtual berry slightly, because the polyphenols, the tannins, will be present in 3 areas. First of all, in the skin, along with the color, but there is also there are phenols in the pips or seeds, and also in the stalks, and we'll need to handle these carefully, and we'll touch upon these later in the presentation. So that's our starting point for winemaking. As a quick recap of the winemaking process in terms of the fermentation, at the heart is that it's an exothermos process, so it will be producing heat throughout as the sugar in our liquid is being converted by the yeast into alcohol, so ethanol, as well as carbon dioxide. In terms of the yeast, I'd like to ponder a bit more on this, because there are 2 major types. One is that we call the ambient yeast, and these ambient yeasts will be those present in the winery. And simply, when the fermentation will start when these ambient yeasts start to eat up the sugar and convert them into alcohol. Whereas there is also an option to use selected strains of yeast, and this is what we call commercial yeast. Now, when you use commercial yeast, you've got actually the option to make a choice between the different qualities of the yeast strains. Some yeast strains will be more alcohol resistant than others. So, for example, if you're making a highly alcoholic wine from very ripe grapes, then you may want to opt for these. Whereas it may also be the case that you're making wine in a cooler region, so for example in a Burgundy cellar, or up in Germany or Champagne. And in these cooler climates in the autumn, temperatures drop quite significantly, so you may want to have yeast that are actually able to ferment at a much lower temperature as well. What is the difference between using just the ambient wild yeast versus the commercial yeast, when you think about taste and the impact on the wine? The difference is that when you have ambient yeast, then you will have lots of different types of strains of yeast that behave differently, and you're not able to decide which particular type you want. So you're having less of a control over your fermentation process. Whereas when you have commercial yeasts, then you're able to select exactly the type of yeast you want, what characteristics they have, and therefore you're able to manage your fermentation more closely. And this is normally desirable when wineries make larger quantities of wine, so to ensure the consistency of their style and what we call often the house style. That said, quite a lot of the big wineries will be using or experimenting with wild yeast fermentation, because wild yeast fermentation is exciting. It gives more sort of personality to the wine. It can also, of course, go wrong easily because you're not able to control fermentation so much. You don't know what yeast you have in there. So that's the basic difference between wild fermentation with ambient yeast versus commercial yeast when you inoculate. Let us then, in the next few slides, consider the various steps involved during the white wine, rosé, and red winemaking process. So we've got the grapes into the cellar during the harvest, and they are bunches of grapes. So the first step in the process is that the winemaker is very likely, not always, but is very likely to remove the berries from the cluster, so from the stalk, and this is the process called de-stemming. The reason why we remove this is because, as I said, the phenols are found in 3 areas: skins, pips, and stalks. The tannins in the stalks are very harsh, very green, very unpleasant. So this is something you want to get out of your wine, and that's why you remove the berries from the stalks. The next one will be to crush the berries so that you are actually start to release the juice from the berries. And by when you do that, as the juice runs out, this is what we call the free run juice, because it has not been pressed. It's just simply by crushing, the juice starts to run off. So it will have a very low amount of tannin because there was no pressing of the skin involved at all. Now, this free run juice is then kept in a tank at a low temperature, because what you want to ensure is that the quality of the juice is kept without oxidation. Oxidation would turn it dark, and it would also start to develop off flavors which are undesirable. In the meantime, you are left with a lot of crushed berries which still contain a great amount of liquid that you want to extract. And that's why you will be pressing in step, as you can see on this flow chart, on step number 2. The press you can see here is what is called a pneumatic press. So practically you've got a stainless cylinder on its side, which is lined with a rubber, and that rubber is starting to be inflated. So it's through pneumatics that there is pressure applied, and that's how the juice is extracted. There are other types of presses that you need to know about. So in addition to pneumatic press, you will also have a classic basket press, which is a wooden basket, and then pressure is applied, and that's how you press the juice out. Or there is also in large wineries the screw press, for example, which is a cylindrical screw continuously going, and this is normally used in large wineries. So you've got the juice out, and this juice is nothing close to your bright, clear glass of wine. This is normally a grey, murky liquid with lots of floating bits in there as you have gone through the destemming and pressing process. So what you want to do is allow this juice some time to settle, and therefore clarify it by removing these rough sediments. Once that, and during this clarification or settling, you will be keeping the must at a low temperature to ensure that the alcoholic fermentation does not start, and to ensure it is protected against oxygen as well, so you avoid unpleasant flavors developing. Once you've got a clear juice, you can start fermentation either by having the ambient yeast or by the commercial strains. Alcoholic fermentation is going to take normally a few days, dependent on, of course, how much sugar there is to be converted into alcohol, how active your yeast is, and during this process, the liquid is moving quite a bit. So normally, after this process, once the alcoholic fermentation is finished, you will allow the wine to settle, so you can take off the rough sediment, the gross lees, and then you've got the clear new wine. Now, it's dependent on whether you're making a bigger, more serious and matured or aged style of wine. You may decide that actually there is still some time before you start the bottle. On the other hand, most of the white wines will be fresh, early drinking, crisp, useful white wines. So at that point in time, there will be no aging involved, but you move on straight to the next process of getting the wine ready for bottling. By fining, clarifying, and filtering, these are techniques I'm going to discuss later during the presentation. But overall, what we can say about fining, clarification, and filtering is that these are 3 techniques to remove different particles or sediments from the wine to ensure that there is a good, what I would call the glass quality, so that it looks good in the glass once it's poured in, once it's poured for the consumer. And once all these have been done, then we can bottle it and make sure that it's ready for shipping to our customers from the winery. So that would be the essence of white wine making. with that, let us have a look at and consider how rosé wines are made. So rosé wines, the major difference, of course, will be in the color. So the base material will be black grapes that you use because, as I said, the color is always in the skin. So you will need to work with black grapes to achieve a certain level of pinkness. And I'm saying a certain level of pinkness, and I could also add a certain, shade of pink, because rosé wines will be varying from whether it's salmon, peach, to having a completely cherry type of shade of pink, and from very light watery to almost cherry red depth as well of the color. Now, black grapes will arrive at the winery, and most of the time these will be destemmed, as I said on this slide and flow chart. It's called stripping. And then the next step will be crushing, or here they use the word stomping. Practically, again, what we want to achieve is that we open up the berries and start to get the juice out and also the color. Now, there are three different ways how we can make rosé wine. One is to ensure that during the red wine making process, we take out watery liquid, which of course will have sugar and acid and other flavor elements in it very early on. So this is practically when the grapes have been crushed. You've got the watery juice, the must, and also the fruit ring on top. And we call it that the juice at the bottom of the tank is being bled off, or with the French word, it's saigné. At the heart of this technique is really the concentration of our red wine by removing water from it. But this water is colored, sugar, and has flavor in it, so it's well suited for fermentation and will produce a lighter style of rosé wine. The reason why it is lighter is definitely because there will be no contact with the skin, so the tannins are really minimized, and it will be normally quite a delicate style of rosé. There are also rosés which are so-called purpose-made or pressed rosés, and here, after crushing the black grapes, the remaining grapes will actually be pressed very gently normally, and to extract color and further juice, and that will be then vinified into a rosé wine. There is also what is called vin gris, or gray wine in French. Then after the crushing, then the grapes are immediately removed, so there is really hardly any maceration or skin contact. Similarly to white wines, the next step will be to make sure that there is sufficient clarity of the juice by allowing the rough particles to settle and get ready the juice for alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation goes through and is converted, and sugar is converted into alcohol, following which there may be some aging, but again, it's very unlikely. And then the next step is blending. Blending is an interesting stage because when you make a rosé that is not made from a single variety, but you may be bringing more together the fruity, juicy nature of a lighter rosé with maybe a more from a different variety that is more spicy, you can really shape or the final flavor profile of your rosé wine through blending, or with the French word assemblage. Once this has happened and you've got the product, then you will be moving on to fining, clarification, and filtration. I will consider these during the next slides, and then you will be ready for bottling your rosé wine. Let us have a look at how red wines and red wine making differs from what we have just what we've just reviewed here. So the next is when we make red wine, and clearly we will need black grapes for this. Most of the red wines will be destemmed. However, there is a technique called whole bunch fermentation, and simply this will be done with grape varieties which are quite delicate, quite thin skins, so there is not a lot of phenols to extract, and that's why they may need to increase it. So the berries are crushed to start the extraction of juice. When we crush berries of black grapes, and we've got all the crushed berries swimming in the must, then you also need to think about that actually what you have done is that you have damaged the skin of the grape. The skin holds the color and the tannins, and you're having this skin soak in an acidic liquid, right? An acidic sweet liquid, which is practically your water, sugar, and acid from the flesh of the grape berry. So the acid starts to attack the skin and start to disintegrate the members of the skin's cells, and thereby starting to release the anthocyanins, so the color material. Now, normally, before fermentation starts, the winemaker may want to allow this to happen for 1, 2, 3, for a few days, practically. This is what is often called the cold soak, because at a cold temperature, to avoid fermentation to start, you soak the skin in the juice, increasing the color extraction. However, there is no alcohol present yet. So then you increase the temperature, which means that either the ambient yeast will start to become active, or you're able to add your yeast that you inoculate the mast with, and then the fermentation process will kickstart. The temperature control during fermentation process is key. One of the reasons why it is key to control it is because the various ethers that are practically the carriers of flavor compounds are very volatile, and the higher the temperature, the more volatile they are, so the more quickly they practically evaporate. So what you have been working for during in the vineyard is to make sure that there is flavor in your wine. Now, if you're exposing it to high temperature and these evaporate quickly, then you're decreasing the fruitiness, the delicate flavors of your wine. So that's number one. Number two is also because high temperature can result in the rougher, more baked and jammy aromas to develop. So what you want to retain is really that nice, fresh, crisp quality of the fruit that you get. So normally white wines, for example, would be made at a lower temperature because they are dominated by those fine aromatic compounds. Whereas in red wines, the temperature can rise higher, but nonetheless, we do need to control it quite strictly as well. Now, in the cold soak, you had the cap submerged in an acidic liquid. Now you have the cap or the skins, not only in an acidic, but in an acidic and alcoholic liquid. So in addition, the membranes of this cell in the skin are attacked also by alcohol. So they are further disintegrated more quickly and faster. And that means that the maceration is increasing. So the extraction of color, the extraction of tannin is accelerating. Of course, your alcoholic fermentation will stop at one point when all the sugar has been converted, or if you make a sweet red wine, then when you decide to change that. And at that point, it's very unlikely that the amount of color that has been extracted is sufficient. So therefore, you continue with maceration, and the maceration in this instance is what we call the post-alcoholic fermentation, so the maceration after the alcoholic fermentation. How can you aid the extraction of both color and tannins at this stage? There are three techniques for this. One, so let us, before we jump into that, let us just clarify that you've got the alcoholic fermentation done, you've got still the crushed berries in there, you haven't pressed it, it's a mix of the skins and a mix of the juice. But by nature, the skins will be floating to the top of the liquid, and that's where they will be sitting. So the problem is that these are not so much in contact with the juice. So what you want to achieve as a winemaker is to make sure that more skin is in contact with the juice to aid that extraction. And what you can do is that either you've got more or less like a flat circle on a stick and you punch it down, or you can also have a circle of a stainless steel circle that is the same size as your vat and has to push down so that the cap is kept submerged in the liquid all the time. Or what an alternative method is that because the cap is up at the top and the juice is down at the bottom, from the bottom of the tank, with the help of a pipe, you can extract the juice, and with the help of a pump, you pump it back on top. As it gets on top of the cap or the skin, it will submerge, and that's how you do it. This is délestage or pumping over. Now, dependent on how long you do it, for how many days, how many times a day do you punch down or do you pump over, at what rate and speed do you pump over, so how harshly or softly does the juice land on top of the cap, you will be influencing the extraction. How much do you extract and how harshly do you extract those tannins and color? So it will be again influencing the mouthfeel of your wine. Once you've reached sufficient level of extraction, you will then move on to pressing out the remaining crushed and fermented berries to get the last juice out. And then we come to aging. It's very likely that red wines will receive some sort of aging, either because you will want to introduce some flavor materials through barrel aging, or because you will want to give time for the tannins to soften up, to mellow, and make it more approachable. We'll have a look at the finishing stage as well before we move on to bottling. So we have reviewed white wine, rosé, and red wine making in terms of how we deal with either color or extraction, or making sure that we keep the finesse of the fruit itself. Let us then, in the next step, look at aging and maturation. Let me just take a sip of tea to clear my throat. So, as I mentioned, some of the wines will have no aging or maturation involved because they have been made to be fresh, fruity, youthful, whether as a white wine or a red wine, and they will go to bottling. However, there are wines which we will want to make sure are introduced and spiced with some masala or flavors, which will come through a number of means. The first one that we can use is called the Surly method in French, that you can see in the first line in brackets, or lees aging. We have discussed that during winemaking, you have a key component, and that is yeast. Yeasts are tiny organisms, and because the alcohol level increases after a while, they just die off. However, what happens is that these, during the fermentation, the liquid is practically moving, it's oscillating, and it's quite murky. Well, at the end of the fermentation, we let it settle, we take off the gross sediment, but then later on, the very fine particles, and these are the dead bodies of the yeast cell, will also start to sink to the bottom. Now, if you leave this in the barrel, then that will be impacting the flavor of the wine. If you want the flavor to be more intense from the lees, then what you can do is exactly what the guy is doing on the top picture here, with a barrel that has been specifically modified to have a glass wall, so we can demonstrate it. And what he does is he puts in a chain on a stick and starts to stir the liquid. So this very fine lees that is settled at the bottom of your barrel is stirred up and is in contact with more juice. Now this will have the wine develop a more creamy texture. If you think about, for example, classic white Burgundy made from Chardonnay, is a fairly northern winemaking region, so there will be crisp acids which are harsher on the palate. So one way to soften this mouthfeel up is that we have this more creamy texture through lees aging. Equally, for example, if you think about Muscadet from the Loire Valley, you can often find Muscadet Surly on the label as well, Surly style. Simply, again, it helps to soften those harsher acids and give some texture to the wine, so to say. So they will be doing this maybe for 2, 3, 4 weeks, dependent on how much lees impact they want to achieve, and they may stir twice, 3, 4 times a day. So that's one way, one technique that you can use during aging and maturation of the wine. Another very popular method of how you can age wine is that you introduce some oak. And I'm saying that some oak because it may be different in what you use and in what quantities. The first choice is between the type of oak that you have. To the so-called French or American oak, each is named French and American because where the species is native. So the French variety is really responsible for the more savory type of aromas, whether it's the cedar, pine, and other savory tones. Whereas American oak is pretty much all about coconut, vanilla, so what we would call the sweet spice flavors. Okay, so that will be a different type of masala box that you have right next to you in your kitchen. That is your cellar, so to say. And then, of course, you need to consider also price points. French and American oak will cost definitely some money. American oak tends to be about 25% cheaper, 25-30% cheaper, depends on exchange rates, than French oak. So if you're thinking that you will be using a barrique size barrel, which is 225 liters, then it's, and a French oak barrel costs you €1,000, it's easy to calculate that a liter of wine will cost about €4 to have oak flavor on it. So translate that to a bottle, about €5 per bottle. Now, if this is 100% new French oak, so one way of influencing that, the amount that you spend on, is whether you put all the wine into 100% new oak. If you decrease that, then of course you can use a barrel for longer periods of time, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depends on, and that will decrease the money that you need to spend on introducing oak flavor. It may also be dependent on what size of barrels you use. The smaller the barrel, the smaller amount of liquid is in contact with larger amount of wood, so it will be more intense. You see a collection of barrels on the right-hand side in the middle row. For example, you will see a very large barrel called the Botte, B-O-T-T-E, that is a normally 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 liter barrels from Italy. So when you think of Chianti, then barrel aged Chianti will normally come from these large barrels. Whereas I mentioned also the 225 barrique size from Bordeaux, or the larger size barrels from Burgundy. So, however, these are normally for premium red wines. What happens when you make a mid-range or an entry level and you still want to have that oak flavor in your wine? Then you may decide that actually in the stainless steel tank, you insert some of these staves, which you can see in the middle photo there, in the mid-level as well. Or if you want to have even less cost with introducing oak flavor, then you will opt for chips, which you will see in the mid-level on the first, on the left-hand side. Chips will be normally giving you less integration. It will be, just not so elegantly, fitting in with the wine. However, if you sell wine for, say, €7 a bottle, then you will not be able to spend, €5 just on oak, because then you will be making no money. And remember, you do need to have a commercial purpose as well. Other types of vessels may well be used as well during winemaking. It's not only oak. In fact, winemakers may want to have the purity of the fruit that they want to showcase, and in that instance, they will be using a stainless steel tank, because they want to avoid any impact of oak, and they want to also have the purity, freshness of the wine without any oxygen influencing it. Oak, of course, is a natural material, slightly porous, so there will be some sort of oxygen transmission through that, even though it's very, very micro amounts, but that will also be shaping the wine. So it's oak barrel contributes both flavor and also that what we call the structural or textural impact. So when you think of big red wines, they are normally barrel aged for a longer period of time, not only to have that flavor, but also the nature of the tannins will be more rounded and polished around the edges, so to say, mellow on the palate. Another way of doing that without oak flavor is that you can use either a porous material such as concrete, or, for example, clay. That's why I've brought in another two photos here. On the left-hand side in the bottom row, you can see what we call amphoras. These were used for the first time about 6,000 years ago in Georgia by winemakers. And then there are concrete tanks. In this instance, I have brought in what you can see a concrete egg, and that will also shape the texture of the wine. And of course, the length of the maturation will be key, as I said, because in some of these materials, so in wood, clay, and concrete, it will have to also soften and mellow, make the tannins more mellow. So there are quite a lot of things you can do during aging and maturation, and this may take 3 months, 6 months, but sometimes it can take 24, 36 months as well, or longer in the cellar. Remember that the time that the wine spends in the cellar is also dependent on what price point you're aiming at for, because you're holding on to your stock, so you're not turning it into cash. So that's again a key, that normally it would be more serious, higher price points where you can afford to do this. If you produce a wine that is very simple, straightforward, all about the fruit, then this is a wine you will not be able to afford to keep in the cellar too long, because it needs to go, it needs to turn into cash. So you've got also a sensible and viable business. However, before wine can leave the cellar, what you need to do is to ensure that the visual impact and experience in the glass for the consumer will be nice. Now, there are a few elements that you may want to remove, and let's focus first on proteins. Proteins, as we know, are our staple of our diet through either dairy, for example, or those who eat meat through meat or fish. However, so it's not poisonous, it's not a problem at all in wine. Why we want to remove protein from wine is because, first of all, it's invisible, but It's invisible at the cellar temperature. However, when the cellar temperature is changing, so for example, you transport wine, and it's in November, December, January, you move wine out of European cellar, the temperature drops, and these proteins will disperse. And when they disperse, they look like as if there was a milky haze in the wine. It will not influence the taste, however, it doesn't look great. So consumers would probably just not want to buy that, and that's why we rather decide to remove it. We simply introduce a material that is oppositely charged electrostatically than the proteins, and then they will attract each other. By attracting each other, they cling on to each other, they become heavy, and they sink to the bottom of the tank or the barrel. This can be very classically egg white that we put in the wine. So, for example, if you think about Bordeaux and Canale, which is a dessert, that the dessert is made from egg yolk, because during winemaking, when they fine the wine, there is a lot of egg yolk left over in Bordeaux. So it's nice to kind of understand how winemaking and cuisine also hang together, not only because of how food is matched with wine, but also that there is a lot of egg yolk left. Other materials can be made from milk, such as casein, isinglass, for example, from fish. Gelatin can be made from bone or fish bone, and bentonite is a porous clay. Again, it can be used for fining the proteins. Then stabilization is the next step, where you will want to remove, for example, tartrates. Tartrates, again, are suspended in the liquid and they are not a problem. But when it becomes cold, then they form crystals, sink to the bottom of the bottle, and the consumer may think that actually there are glass splinters, and that may cause complaints. So that's why we want to remove it. I have come across very fine old vintages of Tokaj and Sauternes where this was present. They did not actually stabilize, and there is no problem with these crystals at the bottom, but these may be removed. Another aspect to consider is that you may have some bacteria or yeast left in the bottle, and in that instance you want to remove those, because either bacteria or yeast will start biochemical processes that normally lead to off flavors, or yeast will restart fermentation, and when that happens, then you've got an issue through the developing carbon dioxide that will expand the bottle, the container, and may explode. And there may be a tiny amount of oxygen left in the liquid, dissolved oxygen, and to avoid that from oxidizing the wine, you introduce a bit of sulfur dioxide, and sulfur dioxide will interact with the oxygen, so tie them down, and thereby protecting the liquid from oxidation. So during fining and clarification, you deal with elements such as protein, tartrates, bacteria, yeast, and oxygen to make sure that the wine is stable, bright, and clear when it's in the glass. And that's, of course, the next step is that you need to package the wine. So when you come to packaging, you will consider factors such as where you will sell the wine, how much you will charge for that wine. So you may be selling a wine in a restaurant, and therefore you are not likely to use a PET bottle that is a plastic, because it just does not look good. But if you're talking about the restaurant, you may have, for example, you have a nice Mediterranean with Italian and Spanish cuisine, or you've got a tapas bar, and actually you've got quite a good turnover of tables, a shorter wine list, and you may have the house white and the house red wine in bag-in-box, what you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. And the bag-in-box comes in 3, 6, or 9 liters. It's a great way of serving wine. It's very environmentally friendly, easier to transport large amounts. you can nicely put on the bar at the back and then get glasses out. As the wine is flowing out of the bag, it does not let oxygen back in, so it protects your wine. It can serve. However, if you're in a fine dining setting, you're not able to do that. You will not be bringing a bag-in-box to the table, so clearly you will be choosing to have bottles of wines, which is very nice to serve, right? Equally, for lifestyle purposes, a winery may focus to sell their wine, that it is consumed on the beach or at parties or garden barbecues, and they may choose a pouch or a Tetra Pak because it's just much more practical. You also may want to consider things such as, for example, the environmental impact, the consumer element. So having bottles, quite often you see, big, expensive, serious red wines in very heavy bottles. Those bottles need to be carried; they need to be transported. So that will increase the carbon emission, carbon footprint, and you can just think about that. So you may want to opt for a glass bottle, but a lighter style. Equally, if you're producing a wine at entry price points, say €5 or €4, then you will not be able to spend so much on bottle, but you will need to have, you may choose to have the PET bottle and so on. So there are lots of considerations. There is no one good packaging that fits, a wine and every wine, but you need to think about price, environmental impact, therefore your image, your consumer, and the setting where it is. And then you will be able to choose the right packaging for your wine. Now, I have come to the end of the of our class today, and what I'd like to do in the remaining about 10 minutes that we have is to open up the floor for questions, as last time we did. I don't know whether, Surab, they have fed questions into you, or shall we also check the chat here?
Peter, just let to inform you the chat box is disabled, and we have informed the students they can send their questions to us directly, and we'll be directing to you.
Okay, then I just wait and we'll get the questions from you guys.
Yes, and we have, I think, all the campus faculties are ready with the question. I maybe just start the question with one of my students is asking. It's not a question; they just need a repeat of. So, can you please repeat the 3 rosé wine color extraction methods once more?
Okay, so one of them will be bleeding off, or saignée. The next one will be the direct press or pressed wine. And then there will be the vin gris, or the, what is the gray wine in French if you translate literally. These are the 3 methods. I will share the deck of slides and then it will be there as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Over to you, Sonia.
Yeah, hi, good morning. The question from here is, what is the difference between French oak and American oak, and which type of oak is good for aging wines?
Okay. So both French and American oak are perfectly good for aging, to start the question from the back. And the differences are in 2. One is the flavor impact, so what type of flavors they impart on the wine, more savory type from French and more sweet spice from American oak. And this is simply the nature of the species of oak. And the difference will also be the density of the fibers. That's slightly different. And as I was saying, there's a commercial aspect. French oak is more expensive, probably due to large demand, a smaller amount of supply of oak rather than American. And therefore, of course, that will impact the financials of your winemaking as well.
Thank you so much.
Over to you, Tomishra.
The question that I have got is, just a moment. does the packaging affect the taste and quality of wine?
Can you repeat the beginning, Tomisha? Sorry.
Does the packaging affect the taste and quality of wine?
Okay. Yes, the answer is that the packaging may impact the quality of the wine that you have in the glass. But I need to be clear that if you put a bad wine into good packaging, it's not going to become good. Whereas if you put a good wine into bad packaging, then it may deteriorate in terms of quality. And the reason is because first of all, you need to make sure that you protect the wine from light. As we have discussed with cellaring conditions, light is really important. So if you put it into a transparent PET bottle, then that will be exposing it to lots of unnecessary light. Then the other aspect is to make sure that you disclose oxygen. So it will be a question of what material it is. Glass and plastic will all disclose oxygen, but how it is closed and how tightly or how perfectly it's sealing, and what is sealing that bottle. So if there's a cork closure, then you may have you will have definitely oxygen transmission through that. Whereas if you use screw cap or pneumacork or others, there you may have complete lack of oxygen. Of course, nowadays some of the producers will produce materials in between the screw cap and the neck of the bottle that can have a minimal oxygen transmission to kind of imitate the cork. And then there will also be the question of cork taint. So trichloroyl anisole, which is the chemical compound carried by the cork, that if it is a cork taint, if cork is tainted and is introducing that taint to liquid, then it will have that wet cardboard rotten off flavor that is unpleasant and will deteriorate the quality of the wine. So that would be how the quality of the wine may be impacted. Normally what you aim for is that you choose the right packaging to preserve the quality the way you want to present it, as you made the wine as it comes out at the time of bottling.
Thank you. And sorry, Saurav and Sonia, another question I will take is related to the same question. Another student is asking that, again, they want you to repeat bag in box packing once more.
Okay, so bag in box is the way you need to imagine is what I say. It's a bag and a box. So you've got a pouch, a plastic bag, 3, 6, 9 liters in size, that is filled up with wine, and then it's completely sealed. There is no oxygen in there. And there is a tap at the other end. Now this bag filled with wine is put into a cardboard box, and therefore that's why it's bag in box. So what happens is that first of all, you can store a lot more wine and carry a lot more wine rather than where you've got bottles and lots of air in between. Lots of empty space left in between bottles. Secondly, it is more environmentally friendly because you can carry more liquid with a lighter packaging, so there will be a lower carbon footprint by the truck or airplane or ship that's carrying the wine. And also, when you open the tap of the bagging box to fill your glass, then practically the bag is decreasing in size, so it's you can keep that liquid, that wine, fresh for a longer period of time. So if it is consumed, a 6-liter bagging box is stored over the course of 2 or 3 days, the wine is still going to be nice and fresh.
Thank you. I'm done with the questions.
Sure.
Thank you, Tomisha. Do we have any Jaipur faculty present here with any question? Then maybe I can go ahead with mine. Okay, for the Jaipur students, if you want to send any question, if your faculty is not present, I'm putting my number in the chat box. You can directly WhatsApp me with your questions. Okay, so Peter, we'll go ahead with the second question from Bangalore. The student is asking you to repeat one more time the difference between the wild yeast and the commercial yeast and its effect.
Okay, so wild yeast are the yeast ambient in the air, and therefore during the winemaking process you don't have a choice of which of these yeast strains will be fermenting, but all of them. So it's kind of like you need to imagine that there is a mixed classroom where there are boys and girls and long hair and short hair and lighter skin and darker skin and younger and older and smiley and more grumpy and friendly and reserved guys in all our colorful nature. We are all there. Whereas the commercial yeast is much more about having exactly the same type. So it's almost like having, all of the guys are 6'6" and they are tall and dark skinned and brown eyes, and they are all very smiley and very kind. Whereas the other group is, the guys who are shorter and blue-eyed and white-skinned and grumpy and unfriendly. So it's really about the fact that the commercial yeast, you can prime it to having a lot of sugar, therefore you need high alcohol resistance, or having cooler climate or warmer climate, or how it will die off during the fermentation as well. So how hungry that yeast is, for example, some of them can withstand higher alcohol, but they just will not be producing more alcohol because they don't eat so much sugar. And that's the fundamental difference. When you select it for the yeast as a commercial yeast for your given circumstances, then you can make a perfect match. So imagine that your door is at a height of 6 foot. Now, if you want to make those 6'6" guys walk through the door, they will be bumping their heads. That will be not a great fit. It's the same thing as when you have, a very ripe grape with lots of sugar, and the wine, the yeast is not able to transform so much sugar. Whereas having the perfect fit will be making life easy and work well, reliably. Now, when you have the wild yeast, as I said, you get a lot more interesting things going on because all this diversity is there, and they will all do their jobs, contribute to the wine. So it will be less uniformly made to a certain fit and size and color. But, one is more reliable. The other gives a bit more excitement of the wild, of the unpredictability.
Thank you so much, Peter. And lovely explanation. I understood it too very clearly. One of the students from Jaipur is messaged me for a question. I'll just quickly take the question. So what is the role of chips in winemaking? Can you please explain it one more time?
Yeah, so chips is oak chips. Therefore, it will be introducing flavor. When we talk about chips, then we don't consider the impact of oxygenation or the impact of tannins, because it's simply all about the flavor, and it will introduce either those more savory French oak flavors, or they will introduce the sweet spice American oak flavors, and at a low price point. So this is a very commercially efficient, low cost way of flavoring your wine with oak.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Sonia.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of my student is asking, how does the finning process in the viticulture, which comes in the vinification process, takes place in vegan wines? In vegan wines. The finning process in vegan wines. How does this process takes place in vegan wines?
Oh, vegan wines.
Yeah.
Now, that's an interesting one because I'm myself vegetarian. I wasn't brought up vegetarian, but I became vegetarian 15 years ago, though admittedly I do eat fish. So I think there is a question here about the technique and the ethical side, or your personal decision. Because if I look at it from the technique side, what I explained was that we've got a fining material that you put into the liquid. It will attach to the protein and sink to the bottom. So, and then you remove that and you've got the liquid. So the liquid that you drink does not have any of the fining agent in it anymore. So whether you're vegan, vegetarian, or carnivore, it shouldn't be a concern because it's still just the fruit juice, but fermented, obviously, wine that we drink. However, there is the ethical question to it that those who don't want their vegan or vegetarian wine to be in contact with anything that is possibly animal product, even, for example, egg white or isinglass, fish product, then they may say, okay, I don't want that. So therefore, they may say, okay, I don't want isinglass and I am okay with egg white fining, or I don't want any of that and I prefer to drink wine that has been fined with bentonite, porous clay material, because that's definitely not living, right? So, so that's the question. That's an ethical consideration, what they want. But then there will be the other two practical considerations to add to that. One is, I give you wines which have been fined with different fining agents, and you will not be able to taste the difference. I can tell you that. You won't be able to say that, oh, this has been fined with, you know, this, no way, that's impossible. That's number one. So therefore, the question also remains the practical side. How do you know what fining material has been used? And of course, if you think of over the past probably few weeks, Cameron Diaz talking about clean wine, and that has sparked a lot of debate in the wine industry. It kind of comes back to the labeling and the ingredient labeling, that, you know, how much do we talk about how wine is made, how it has been produced, for example, fined. In some instances, there will be a lot more information than other winemakers. It depends on the producing country. It depends on also the country where it's exported, and how actively the importer, for example, the Indian importer, works with the winery and the market, that how they want and what they want to communicate. I would say that if it is an ethical consideration for you, then I understand it and completely accept it, and it's your choice. Hopefully you will get the information, but otherwise I would encourage you to just, you know, taste wines regardless of the fining, because you won't be able to taste the difference, and there will be no fining agent left in there that you should worry about anyway.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you. Over to you, Saurabh.
Tomishra, any question from your side?
No, I have covered 3 questions that I had. Thank you.
I can see Mr. Sachin Singhwal is here. Sir, do you have any question from your student side, or are you asking any question? I don't know, you can mute yourself or not. You have to make co-host, I believe. Fine, I'll go ahead with the next.
Sachin Singhwal is the host.
Okay,
yes,
sir.
He is unmuted.
Yes. Sir, do you have any question from the student side?
No, sir.
Okay, no problem. Maybe I'll go ahead with the next question. Rinku, would you like to ask the question? Okay, I'll go ahead with the question. So one of my students is asking us, sir, please explain once more solely aging and its effect to the winemaking.
So surly aging is the aging on the fine lees. Fine lees comes from the dead bodies of the yeast cells that sink to the bottom, and they are a very fine sediment. Now, if you leave this on, then it will impart a flavor which is a creamy, buttery in terms of flavors. And when you stir the lees, then you more intensely allow the wine to collect these flavors. And normally it's used with wines which are high in acid content, and therefore kind of needs, so to say, a bit of polishing around the edges by giving this softer mouthfeel.
Thank you so much. Sonia, any question?
Yeah, one more question I got. is amphora is more hygienic as compared to the other vessels? The student is asking.
So amphora is more hygienic or not?
Yes, this is the question he's asking.
Okay, so the most hygienic will always be stainless steel, because it's an inert material, it's the easiest to clean. As soon as you go into oak, concrete, amphora from clay, the more porous it is, the more likely, the more difficult it is to clean these materials. Of course, that's why good cellar hygiene is really important, because you will wash the barrels, and you will also normally with some sulfur strips kill off anything that may have left on the wall of these. So in those terms, the hygiene really comes back to the techniques used in the cellar and the rigor applied as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Hi, Peter. There is one question from Bangalore campus as well. Sorry, I didn't reply to this because there was a network issue. So one of my students, she's asking about what is the pump over in maceration process in red wine?
So the pump over, thank you for that, Rinku. The pump over is a process where you've got the tank of liquid, that's your tank, the cap is swimming up at the top, and what you want is you take out the juice and you pump it over on top of the cap, so that the cap of skin will submerge into the liquid and will be in contact with it and have extraction, okay? So it's an extraction technique.
Thank you.
Peter, I have something to ask you. If the students want to get into learning of this, do you recommend any YouTuber, any videos or something that they can see the videos of pump over and all this thing and understand it in a better way?
Well, I would say that it's going to be a bit of a hit and miss to bring together, because the materials are probably going to be mostly with wineries. So then the best would be to either put in a keyword search and look at wineries' websites, because they normally want to showcase how they work and what they do. So you can learn about the region as well, in addition to the technique. That's definitely there.
Okay, thank you so much. One last question from Bangalore campus side I have. Sir, can you please explain the standard temperature for fermentation of red and white wine, and does it vary country to country?
Okay, so white wines would normally be fermented at a lower temperature. That can be anything 10 to 14, and red wines will normally go up around 24, 28. Some of them go up to 32, 34. It depends on really the winemaker, because you may also want in some regions to have open tank fermentation, which allows the evaporation of alcohol and also oxygen to mellow the tannins. So it will be changing not so much from region to region, but it's more about the color and the style of wine. So, for example, if you think about India, the temperature control will be the same sort of target that they need to work with. Of course, pressure is a lot higher, because if you think about, for example, Krisma estates in the Hampi Hills in mid-state Karnataka will have a lot of a lot higher temperature during winemaking than if you think about the Rhone in the autumn in Europe. So it's regions in that regard just have a different pressure on how much to control temperature, but there will need to be a control everywhere.
Thank you. Will you please mention the time period also once for both red and white?
So time period.
The like duration of fermentation, like how long the fermentation goes.
Right. So white wines, normally the fermentation would finish anything between 5 to 10 days, because there you don't have to bother so much at all or at all with the skins of the grapes. Whereas the fermentation and the whole winemaking process for red wines will be longer, because you will have maybe a few days, 1, 2, 3, 4 days of cold soak when you're actually not doing alcoholic fermentation. Then alcoholic fermentation will take place, and that can be again 5 to 10 days or so, 14 days, depends on how cool it is. The cooler, the longer it will take. And then, of course, with red wine, you may have maceration. So post-alcoholic fermentation maceration, when you leave the skins in the juice. And that can be anything, you know, from a few days to up to sometimes 3-4 weeks as well, dependent on what style of wine they want to achieve. You know, more extraction, the heavier, the deeper in color.
Thank you so much, Peter. We are done with the question from Bangalore side. Over to you, Sonia. Any question?
Yeah, last question. The student is asking, what is the correct cellar temperature of red and white wines? Are they different or are they same for the cellar temperature?
Okay, so in a cellar, you normally would want to have around, you know, somewhere between 14 to 16 degrees. But in some countries, you will not be able to really influence that so much, because you build a cellar and the cellar will have its natural temperature range simply by being underground. So, for example, our cellar is such here in Hungary, in my region, or in my cellar. But in other areas, you may have actually where you've got full control, and then you can set it that your cellar is always at 16 degrees. So it really depends on, but that is an ideal one, because as we have discussed during the first lesson, as much for the cellaring, once the wines are in your stock in the hotel, is the same in the winery. You know, the cooler, constant temperature is what they like and benefit from.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you.
Any other question from any more campus? No, I think we are done with the question answer session. Indeed, it was a great session. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, over to you, Peter, please.
Okay, well, thanks so much, guys, for all the questions. Great to have you all. And I will be back with you guys tomorrow. I think we'll have some fortified wines to talk about. So have a good rest of the day, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much,
Thank you
Peter.
so much,
Thank you.
Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.